Stand with me on the mainland shore, looking out across a half-mile of open water at a city built specifically to never fall. Tyre sits on its own island, walls rising straight out of the sea on every side, and for as long as anyone can remember, that water has done more to protect this city than any army ever could. No conqueror in living memory has taken Tyre by force. The man standing beside you on this shore, fresh off the greatest victory of his young life, has just been told by the city's own council that he may not enter to worship at their temple. He takes that refusal as something closer to a declaration of war. What does it actually take to conquer a city the ocean itself was supposed to protect? If you want the real, verified story of the siege that broke Tyre's 1,000-year reputation, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. By the start of 332 BC, Alexander of Macedon has already shattered the main Persian field army at Issus, sending the great King Darius fleeing and opening the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline to Macedonian control. City after Phoenician city along that coast submits without much resistance. Tyre does not. When Alexander requests entry to sacrifice at the city's temple to Heracles, a god the Tyrians themselves worship under a different name, the council refuses him, offering instead to let him sacrifice at an older temple on the mainland. It is on its surface a modest religious compromise. Alexander does not read it that way. He reads it as a test of whether a king who has just humiliated the Persian Empire can be defied by a single island city, and he decides immediately that the answer will be no. There is a harder strategic logic sitting underneath the religious insult too. Alexander's own navy is nowhere near strong enough to challenge Persia's fleet directly, and that Persian fleet still depends heavily on Phoenician harbours, Tyre most of all, for its bases along this coast. Marching on toward Egypt while Tyre remains in Persian hands means leaving an enemy naval base sitting directly behind his own army and supply lines. Alexander cannot simply walk past this city. He has to take it, or he has to accept a threat at his back for the rest of the campaign. Alexander sends envoys into the city one more time, offering terms rather than opening with force outright. The Tyrians answer that offer by killing his representatives and throwing their bodies from the walls into the sea below, in full view of the Macedonian camp. Whatever hope remained for a negotiated surrender ends with that single act, and Alexander orders the siege to begin in earnest. The problem is that Tyre has never actually needed an army to survive a siege. It has needed water. The city sits roughly half a mile offshore, walls reportedly rising over 150 feet directly from the sea in places, with no natural land approach at all. Alexander has no navy capable of matching Tyre's fleet on the open water, and a land army, however large, cannot simply walk across open ocean to reach a wall. So Alexander decides to solve a naval problem with an engineering one. He orders his men to build a causeway, a solid land bridge of stone, timber and rubble, stretching directly out from the mainland to Tyre's own walls, using the ruins of the abandoned mainland settlement known as Old Tyre as raw material. Now watch that impossible engineering project actually take shape, and feel how quickly it turns from ambitious to desperate. You watch the work go well at first. Near the mainland, the water is shallow and the seabed soft, and the causeway extends steadily outward week after week. But the sea does not stay shallow. As the mole approaches the island itself, the bottom drops sharply, eventually to something close to 18 feet, and every additional yard of progress now costs Alexander's engineers far more effort than the yard before it. Tyrian ships harass the working parties constantly, rowing close enough to fire on the exposed labourers before retreating out of reach, forcing Alexander to build protective screens and eventually siege towers directly onto the causeway itself, just to keep his own men alive long enough to keep building. Alexander leans on more than engineering to keep his own army's confidence steady through this grinding, expensive work. His personal seer, a man named Aristander, interprets a dream in which the god Heracles himself reaches out and invites Alexander into the city, reading it as a promise that Tyre will fall, though only, Aristander warns, through genuinely difficult effort. When Alexander later dreams of a satyr dancing across his own shield, Aristander breaks the Greek word for satyr into two pieces, Sa and Tyros, and tells the army it means Tyre is already his. Whether Alexander truly believes any of this, or simply understands its value for morale, an army grinding through month after month of expensive, frustrating siege work clearly needs something beyond engineering to keep believing the effort is worth it. If watching an engineering project turn slowly and expensively impossible interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. The Tyrians answer Alexander's siege towers with one of the more inventive weapons of the entire ancient world. They take an old horse transport ship, pack it with dry branches, pitch and sulphur, and hang cauldrons of oil from its masts so that the burning fuel will rain directly down onto whatever it strikes. They tow this floating bomb up against the causeway, set it alight, and watch Alexander's siege towers and protective works go up in flame within minutes, months of grinding labour undone in a single afternoon. It is by any honest measure a genuine tactical humiliation, and Alexander's response to it says as much about him as anything that happens later in this siege. He does not abandon the causeway. He orders it rebuilt, wider this time, and turns his full attention to the one problem that has made the entire project so painfully slow in the first place. He does not control the sea around the city he is trying to take. What actually changes that is not, as some retellings simplify it, a dramatic mass defection of the Phoenician navy to Alexander's side. It is a more structural consequence of everything Alexander had already accomplished before he ever arrived at Tyre's gates. The Phoenician cities of Byblos, Arwad, and Sidon had already submitted to him without a fight, and their fleets, which together had made up the overwhelming majority of the entire Persian navy, come under Alexander's command simply because their home cities now answer to him. That alone hands him roughly 80 warships. The king of Cyprus sends a further 120 war galleys once it becomes clear which side of this conflict is actually winning, and a squadron of Greek Ionian ships adds 23 more, giving Alexander a combined fleet of somewhere near 223 galleys, a navy Tyre's own defenders, who had ruled these waters unchallenged for generations, now find themselves badly outnumbered by. With that fleet finally under his command, Alexander blockades both of Tyre's harbours at once, sealing the city off completely from resupply or reinforcement by sea, the one advantage that had kept Tyre safe through every previous siege in its long history. Siege engines mounted directly onto ships begin battering the seaward walls at point-blank range, a tactic no defender inside Tyre had ever needed to plan for because no attacker had ever possessed the naval strength to attempt it. Tyre's defenders answer with their own inventive countermeasures at nearly every stage. Hides stuffed with seaweed are hung along the walls as cushions to absorb the impact of incoming stones, and according to the historian Diodorus, mechanical wheels mounted on the battlements spin fast enough to knock aside incoming catapult bolts before they strike, though modern historians treat that particular claim with some real skepticism. When Alexander's ramships run into large underwater blocks of stone the Tyrians have deliberately placed to keep the rams from ever reaching the wall itself, he has the obstacles hauled away with cranes mounted on barges. When Tyrian divers slip out at night to cut the anchor cables holding his ramships in place, Alexander simply replaces the rope with chain, a small technical fix that the defenders now have no easy way to counter. Inside the city, meanwhile, many Tyrians reportedly dream that their own patron god Apollo is preparing to abandon them for Alexander's side, an omen taken seriously enough that the citizens physically bind the god's bronze statue to its pedestal with cords, nailing it down and mockingly calling it an Alexandrist, as if a god's own statue might otherwise simply walk out of the city on its own. If the idea that Alexander's real breakthrough came from patient fleet building rather than one dramatic naval battle interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. Now feel that 7-month siege finally reach its breaking point. You watch the ship-mounted battering rams finally open a real breach in Tyre's southern wall, wide enough now for armed men to force their way through rather than simply widen with further bombardment. Alexander leads the assault through that breach personally, rather than sending others in first. At only 24 years old, already established as a commander who fights in the front rank, rather than directing battles from behind it, part of a pattern that will define his entire career and eventually contribute to his own death, years later from wounds taken in exactly this kind of close combat. What has been, until this point, a siege fought largely at range with engines and fire, becomes street-by-street fighting inside the city itself, Macedonian marines pouring in from ships on both harbour sides at once while the breach party pushes inward from the south. 7 months of frustrated engineering finally converted, in the space of a single day, into the oldest and simplest form of warfare there is. The brutality of what follows the city's fall is inseparable from a second, later atrocity, distinct from the killing of Alexander's envoys months earlier. In the siege's final stretch, the Tyrians capture a group of Macedonian sailors and execute them on the walls themselves, in full view of Alexander's entire army, their bodies then thrown down, where the besiegers could see exactly what had been done to their own men. Ancient sources disagree sharply on the scale of what Alexander's own forces do in response once the city actually falls. Quintus Curtius Rufus records 2,000 Tyrians crucified along the beach in the aftermath. Arrian's account instead describes as many as 8,000 civilians killed during the sack itself. Neither figure is comfortable to sit with, and this channel will not pretend the disagreement between sources makes the underlying reality any less brutal. Somewhere close to 30,000 people, residents and refugees from the wider region who had sheltered inside Tyre's walls, are sold into slavery in the aftermath, an entire city's population effectively erased from the place it had called home for centuries. This is not a footnote to soften. Whatever the exact numbers, a great many real people died or lost their freedom inside those walls once the fighting ended, and that fact deserves to sit in the account with the same weight as anything else this siege produced. Amid that brutality, one specific act of restraint survives in the record clearly enough to be worth naming directly. Those who took shelter inside the city's Temple of Melqart, including Tyre's own king, are spared by Alexander's explicit order, sanctuary honoured even in the middle of a sack this violent. It does not undo what happens to everyone outside that temple's walls. It does mean the destruction of Tyre, brutal as it genuinely was not total in the way some later retellings imply. The strategic payoff of all this arrives almost immediately. With Tyre gone as a functioning Persian naval base, the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline stands effectively closed to Persia's fleet, and Alexander's own rear and supply lines are secure for the march that follows. Egypt submits to him without a fight within months, and less than 2 years after Tyre's walls finally fall, Alexander meets Darius for the final time at Gargamella, ending the Persian Empire's ability to field an army at all. None of that later campaign happens the same way, or on the same timeline, if a hostile naval base sits unresolved behind Alexander's own lines the whole time he is trying to press deeper into the Persian heartland. Before we return to that shoreline one last time, if this channel's telling of history, the honest kind that keeps the brutality and the restraint in the same frame rather than choosing one, is something you want to carry with you, our own merchandise is linked below. Tyre's own defenders, and much of the ancient world watching this siege unfold, had one specific historical memory shaping their confidence that this city simply could not be taken. Nearly 250 years earlier, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II had laid siege to this same city, and later tradition, repeated for centuries afterward, remembers that siege lasting a legendary 13 years, the ultimate proof of Tyre's supposed invincibility. That specific number comes from exactly one ancient source, the 1st century historian Josephus, writing many centuries after the events he describes. The more commonly transmitted figure in surviving ancient manuscripts is considerably shorter, closer to 3 years and 10 months. And the detail that actually matters most gets lost entirely in the popular 13-year version of the story. However long Nebuchadnezzar's siege genuinely lasted, he never took the city by force at all. It ended, by every reliable account, inconclusively, Tyre's walls still standing and its own king still on his throne when the Babylonian army finally withdrew. Alexander needed 7 months. Nebuchadnezzar needed years by even the most conservative count and still failed. The legend of Tyre's invincibility that Alexander's own defenders leaned on for confidence was, when actually checked against what happened after Nebuchadnezzar's own campaign, built on a siege that had never actually succeeded in the first place. So think back to that shore, to a city walled in by open water and 1,000 years of never having fallen. You were never simply watching one king's engineering project succeed against long odds. You were watching a legend of invincibility, built on a siege that had never actually worked, finally meet a commander patient enough to solve the problem in stages, a causeway when direct assault would not work, a navy built from the wreckage of his own previous conquests when the causeway alone would not be enough, and a willingness to lead the final breach himself once both of those pieces were finally in place. What happened to Tyre once its walls came down deserves to be remembered honestly, rather than glossed over for the sake of a clean, triumphant ending. Both of those things, the brilliance of the siege and the brutality of what followed it, are part of the same real history, and this channel exists to tell both. A city that had genuinely never fallen, that had outlasted a Babylonian king's own years-long siege a quarter of a millennium earlier, fell to a 24-year-old in 7 months, and the walls he tore down never fully rose the same way again. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the legends checked against what actually happened, the sieges won through patience rather than a single dramatic stroke, the endings honest enough to hold both triumph and brutality at once, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the shadow.